And George Kelly, we all need to be reminded that political correctness has been around for a long time. George got his PhD in 1973, and I know a little bit about academic political correctness because that's the year I got my law degree. And I think it's fair to say that my professors reflected the view in academia about police and disorder. Police officers were uneducated, insensitive, racist, blue-collar thugs who were suppressing the legitimate aspirations of poor people, black people, other minorities, and lower-class people in general. As to the desire for order among the public, that was one part bourgeois fetish and one part a thin veil for racism. The solution to this problem, as it was viewed by the conventional wisdom, was to get cops out of intimate contact with people in the community so they would stop the corruption, get them into cars where they could be controlled by centralized police headquarters, sending them around on calling them in on 911, and having them drive around the neighborhoods to scare the criminals and reassure the public. It was against this background that George, with his newly minted PhD, started his first research project, which was to walk around on foot patrol with white police officers in a black neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, thus to better observe at close hand the aforementioned bigoted police officers and the aforementioned community under suppression. His second major project was a major evaluation of the new kind of the solution, the police officer in the car being run by 911, called the Kansas City Preventive Control Study. What he found was that the conventional wisdom, a powerful grip on academia, was utterly at odds with what he saw with his eyes. He saw a desire for order deeply felt by working class citizens, white and black alike. Preventive patrol, the new style of policing, was a failure, and intimate relations between officers and robust discretion by those officers were badly needed. I've often wondered why George, at this point, did not take the lesson of my daughter's favorite bedtime story, which was The Emperor Who Had No Clothes. Now, you may think the lesson of that is that the child saw the emperor with no clothes, but the key thing was the child looked without an understanding of the dangers of confronting the emperor. And the other thing is people believed the child because the child was without pretensions. George saw that the emperor had no clothes. He understood full well the power of the emperor and the wrath of the emperor's courtiers. Still, he went forward. He wrote his book, Kansas City Preventive Patrol. When I've tried to understand why and understand George, I think I found the kernel of it. His PhD, which most of us thought was in sociology or criminology, was in social work. George is a social worker trapped in the body of someone who is studying police. He has an instinctive respect and sympathy for the blue-collar workers that make up our police forces and an intuitive sympathy of the people who live in neighborhoods who need the protection and involvement of the police. So, he spent 25 years fighting the conventional wisdom. He spent more time with cops and people in neighborhoods than any other academic in America. When other people were looking at spreadsheets, George was talking to cops. He went and established as the first director the criminal justice program at the Kennedy Institute and directed it in its crucial early years from 1980 to 1987, and then remained in academia both at the Kennedy School and at Rutgers. He's advised police practitioners. He's actually been a key architect of very important new programs in New York, which we've all heard about. Thankfully for all of us, George is not just a practitioner and a thinker, but he's a writer. His article with James Q. Wilson in 1984 in the Atlantic, Broken Windows, I would argue perhaps the most important article on crime in the United States in the past 25 years. His book, I'm assured by one of his colleagues, his first book on preventive patrol in Kansas City, may have been the most important book, but I'll now say that Fixing Broken Windows captures for the rest of us his unique wisdom, and I might add it's been vastly enriched by insights from his wife, Catherine Coles, who is both a lawyer, thank goodness for Catherine, the lawyers are no longer beat up in George's book, and an anthropologist. Broken Windows, I argue, it's one of the most important books on the bookshelves of the bookstores of the United States of America today. If every mayor, every city council member, every police chief, every neighborhood organization for safety, and every journalist who covers crime issues in this country were to read this book in the next 30 days, I believe that policing and the safety of American neighborhoods could be transformed. Thus, I'm delighted that all of you are going to have the chance to hear in person the author of Fixing Broken Windows, George Kelly.
Thank you, Roger. I hadn't thought about being trapped in that sense before with my... It takes a village to write a book as well. And a lot of the villagers are here. And I can't refer to many of them, but many of you know who I'm talking about. I've worked with many of you for many years, know your work, have appreciated it. I do want to acknowledge Larry and the Manhattan Institute. They've been very supportive of my work. Larry has been very, very helpful, a critic, and I've benefited enormously. I also want to mention Pat Murphy. Pat was president of the foundation during the days when it still had a little bit of Ford Foundation money left, just a little bit left. Now, I had gotten a lot of it. I had gotten a whole lot of it due to the Kansas City study and other studies, but there was a little bit left. And Pat asked me to go to New Jersey and walk on foot patrol and find out what was going on. And I came back and I said, Pat, something very interesting is happening in foot patrol in New Jersey. And Pat arranged for me to get the last big chunk of money out of the Police Foundation, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that enormously, and I recognize Pat's contribution to policing generally and to change in policing. Restoring order and reducing crime is a little bit like milking a camel. Camels can be milked, but anyone who's milked a camel understands that when you do, you're going to get bit, kicked upon, spit on, and abused in a whole variety of ways. Now, police chiefs know this. People who have been involved in the change in policing understand this. And they understand then that if you milk a camel, the first requirement is that you really have to mean it. You got to want to milk that camel very, very badly. And I think we know now how to milk that camel when we're talking about crime in our society. I think we know a whole lot about restoring order, preventing crime, reducing crime, and we have wonderful success stories, and they're no longer just minor stories. A lot of stuff is coming together in a very, very powerful way. And I think we've figured out a lot of the mistakes of the past, but we've known about that now for probably a decade and a half. But we're starting now to put together a point of view that I think gives great promise for the future, and I want to talk about that. In 1975, I spent a lot of time conducting the Newark Foot Patrol experiment. The findings were very interesting. If you added foot patrol to a neighborhood, fear of crime dropped enormously. If you took foot patrol away, fear of crime increased enormously. If you added foot patrol, citizen appreciation for officers increased enormously. If you took it away, it decreased. Now, the question was, why was there that powerful impact from foot patrol? Why was it that you had, and understand we had 13 fear variables in the study, to use technical phrases, and every one showed powerful drops in fear of crime? Well, the obvious answer was, well, foot patrol is a felt presence in a community. If you add foot patrol, citizens immediately recognize it. If you take it away, they recognize it as well. And so it's a felt presence. But think about that for a minute. In Newark, New Jersey, where I observed foot patrol, they were on a beat maybe 30 hours a week at most. You know, they have court time. It never rains on a foot patrol officer. They have a variety of administrative responsibilities. And so, of a total week, they're probably on a beat not more than 20 to 30 hours a week, which isn't much time in the totality of the time of a week, probably around 20%. Well, when I presented this to groups of colleagues, of course, their recommendation was go back to your field notes, go back to your observations, look at what foot patrol officers were doing, because maybe it had to do with what actually officers were doing rather than just their presence. And going back to my field notes and recalling what I discovered, that police officers were involved in setting standards with citizens, and I include all citizens in that, everything from street people, and the quote, quote, homeless and youths, setting standards about what appropriate behavior was in that community. You could have a bottle, despite drinking laws, but it had to be in a brown paper bag. You could drink out of that bottle, but not on Market or Broad Street. You had to go around to the alley. You could panhandle, and this was interesting, and it was way ahead of its time. You could panhandle from people who were moving, but you couldn't panhandle from people who were standing still. And we all understand the meaning of that now in terms of who controls that contact. You could sit on the stoop of a store, but you couldn't lie down. In other words, police were involved intuitively in negotiating a consensus about what was appropriate behavior in that neighborhood. And the interesting thing was that consensus became self-enforcing. And that is, people knew what was appropriate behavior, and everyone had a vested interest in that. And the street people had a vested interest in that as well. Now, that's a little complicated to try and explain now, but in a whole variety of ways, including street people ridiculing their colleagues when they broke the law or broke the rules and came in contact with police, ridiculing the other street person rather than ridiculing or getting on the case of the officer. Now, after the Newark Foot Patrol study was published, James Q. Wilson read it and said to me, "Do you want to do a piece together for the Atlantic?" And I said, fine. He could meet all his obligations to me by citing the book, but Jim, typically generous, said, no, let's do it together. And so we produced the article, Broken Windows. And broken windows was essentially a metaphor, and many of you know it. And it went like this: just as a broken window left untended is a sign that nobody cares and leads to more physical damage to property, so untended disorderly behavior is a sign that nobody cares and leads to more serious disorderly behavior, serious crime, and ultimately decline of the quality of life. Now, the response to the article was fascinating, and the response generally came from three categories of people. The first were citizens with whom I was having contact with. The second was police, and the third were my academic colleagues. Right after I finished the Newark Foot Patrol study, I was working with citizens looking at community crime control groups. And if this happened once, it happened a dozen times. I'd go in and meet with the group. They'd conduct their meeting. After the meeting, they'd have coffee. They'd ask me, well, why are you here? What are you interested in? And I say, well, I'm interested in what your problems are, how you're dealing with your problems. And time again, somebody would go over to the cocktail table, over to the table, grab some papers, and hand it to me and say, if you want to know what the problems are, read this. And they'd hand me Broken Windows. and then they start telling stories about their contacts with police. And that is, they say, you know, the police come to these meetings, they come with their printouts, they want to talk about burglary, and they want to talk about robbery, and they want to talk about serious crime, and that's fine, but we're concerned about the prostitutes who are harassing our husbands in front of the children. We're concerned about youths who have taken over parks, and we can't use the parks anymore, and our children can't use the parks. We're concerned about public urination and defecation and panhandling. And I'd hear this again and again and again. And of course, it doesn't matter now where I go. I go to the toughest areas of New York, the toughest areas of New Haven, toughest areas of Boston, you name it. You ask citizens to list what their most serious problems are, even when murder is at high rates, and they'll be telling you about graffiti, public drinking, drunks down, aggressive prostitution. If you list the top 10, 8 of them are going to be problems of disorder. And so what Broken Windows meant for them was that it gave voice to a demand for dealing with these problems that weren't being responded to. The police response was equally interesting. The police would recount the same stories. I know, we go to the meetings and we talk about burglary and we talk about robbery, and the citizens want to talk about the minor problems. And we just don't have time. We're so backed up with calls for service, and we got to deal with the serious calls for service, and so we just can't respond to them. The third response was from academics and elites. And most of them were quite embarrassed for me, because I was raising questions that we all thought had been answered during the 1960s. Even some colleagues understood my position completely, and that was, I was a fascist. That was clear. Because the questions that I was raising was, that Jim and I were raising, and that were being raised in communities is, first of all, what about this business of tolerating nonviolent deviance? Is nonviolent deviance really not a major problem? Ought we to be so tolerant in our cities that as long as somebody doesn't hit me in the face, as long as somebody doesn't assault me, my obligations as a citizen is to tolerate all kinds of behavior, in-your-face behavior? Do we really want to tolerate nonviolent deviance? And is it the case that nonviolent deviance is really victimless crime? Is it the case that prostitution is victimless crime? Is it the case that drunken behavior, loutish drunken behavior in parks, is victimless crime? Well, in the one respect, if you take a traditional view that there is an individual who has been victimized, many times not. But if you take a different position, and that is the aggregate consequences of many minor offenses, turn a community into a victim, wipe out entire neighborhoods, shopping centers, lead citizens to move, lead citizens to lock themselves behind their doors, and if you think of the community as victim, then there is a victim indeed. And of course, the final argument that was embarrassing for them was, of course, this was a form of cultural imperialism. And that was what Kelling really had, was a housekeeper's mentality. A place for everything and everything in its place that he wanted to impose upon people who were different. Because one person's disorder is another person's expression of cultural diversity and cultural traits. And that was widely believed and widely touted. But since when is drunken behavior in parks a sign of a cultural trait? When is public urination and defecation a sign of cultural diversity and ought to enrich us by learning about additional cultures? Since when is aggressive panhandling that grabs onto you a sign of cultural diversity or a trait of either the poor or minority groups? What a patronizing view this was. We were talking about illegal behavior that's been considered illegal behavior for a long period of time, about which there's broad agreement regardless of social class. It wasn't rich people I was going to see in neighborhoods and asking them what the problems were. These were poor people in the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. If these kinds of things were going out in front of the homes that most of us live in who are in this room, you can bet your bottom dollar it would be stopped very quickly. We simply wouldn't tolerate it. But, of course, in minority communities or in poor communities, well, that was a sign of cultural diversity. What a bankrupt point of view that was. But it wasn't just that point of view, because many people began to say, well, maybe we ought to experiment with the idea of broken windows. And the National Institute of Justice, and some people in NIJ might remember this, put out a request for a proposal to do an experiment in order maintenance. And what was going to be done was to experiment with order maintenance and see if order maintenance reduced fear and if it reduced crime. And the plans were developed. There were going to be experiments in two places, Houston and Newark. And in 1982, those plans went to the Attorney General for review, and the Attorney General scratched the experiment. You could experiment with fear reduction, but you could not experiment with order maintenance. They weren't going to get into those kinds of activities. So the first opportunity, really to experiment in an informal way with the impact of restoring order, fortunately Robert Kiley set up in the New York City subway. When he asked me in 1989 to come in and see if I could do something about the conditions in the New York City subway. I won't go into the details of that, but after a year of planning, ultimately bringing in William Bratton as chief, once order was restored, crime immediately began to drop. Crime is now down over 80% in the New York City subways. And if anyone had told you in 1985 that the subways of New York City, that crime would not be a subway, crime would not be a problem in New York City's subway, in 1995, they would have proposed reopening some of the institutions to place you in, because those of you who remember what it was like then knew that it was an impossible environment. And of course, we all know that now Bratton developed similar policies in New York City, and we just saw after murders declining from just a few years ago, almost 2,500 to under 1,000 last year. This year, in the first quarter, murders are down another 25%, robbery is down, and in some of the toughest neighborhoods in New York City. And the primary emphasis has been restoring order, getting the information, and focusing on people who are creating these low-level kinds of problems. Now we have other stories. Dallas in the downtown area, focus on order maintenance, the involvement of bids. Crime is down 60%. Same thing in Atlanta. You can go from city to city and identify these kinds of efforts in which there have been very dramatic drops in crime. Boston is a fascinating example right now. 17 gang-related murders in 1995, none in 1996. In direct response to a planned operation by prosecutors, police, probation officers, and community to establish control over gangs and say, enough is enough. So, if we want to restore order and prevent crime, then what has to be done? First, we have to get to high moral ground. Crime control has been held hostage for the last 30 years to various ideologies that say you have to have broad social change before you can deal with crime. And the rhetoric has gone something like this. Crime is caused by social injustice, racism, economic inequalities. Police can't do anything about those problems. Ergo, police can't do anything about crime. I have no quarrel with the idea that crime is linked to those problems. But I also believe very strongly that unless you deal with those problems in communities, you can't think about economic restoration. You can't think about redevelopment of communities. You can't think about restoring inner cities. When churches can't function, when youths and thugs are breaking into churches during the funerals of their folks and shooting up the churches, as they did in Boston, when good kids start carrying guns to go to school, when whole areas are taken over by youths and the police response is to send a car, and send a car, and send a car, and the youths stay in control of the streets. Those are simply intolerable conditions that we now know how to manage. That is, the high moral ground was that in the subway, it wasn't the rich against the poor. The rich don't ride in the subway. They're in limousines and taxi cabs. It's the working class and the working poor that ride the subway and deserve decent transportation. Secondly, as Roger knows, you better prepare to go to court. Because if you decide to restore order, you're going to get sued. And you're going to run into a whole set of assumptions that have ideological bases about freedom of speech and a whole variety of other issues that you better be prepared to address in the very way you plan your program. Because unless you plan it properly and lay it out properly and have a clear rationale for it, you're simply not ready to go to court, because this needs more than just technical legal arguments. The third thing is, if you decide to restore order and prevent crime, understand that it takes time. Now, it doesn't take time once you implement, but it takes time to plan. It took us almost a year to figure out what to do in the subway. The drop was immediately. Regarding squeegee men in New York City, it took us 6 months. When Ray Kelly asked me to come in, it took us 6 months to figure out what to do. Within 3 weeks, squeegee men were gone. In Boston, it took them 15 months to figure out what to do about gangs. But the impact was immediate. So you've got to think this through. You've got to plan. You've got to have the upfront investment. It just doesn't happen immediately. The fourth thing is, you got to do it right. Order maintenance used to be done in abusive ways. There's no doubt that police were hassling people, and laws against loitering, laws against vagrancy, laws against panhandling were used to keep people out of neighborhoods, particularly African Americans. They were nothing but an extension of the black codes that kept African Americans in virtual slavery throughout most of the 19th century. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about doing it right, operating within the law, and I just want to make a quick comment. We know that in the first 60 years of this century, criminal investigation was primarily conducted with torture. The third degree and other means were widely known in policing. The Wickersham Commission exposed the amount of torture that was used in criminal investigation. Now, nobody said, well, you shouldn't do criminal investigation because there was abuse. They said clean up criminal investigation, but because chiefs wouldn't do it or couldn't do it, the Supreme Court finally said, all right, enough's enough, and we had Escobedo, exclusionary, etc. To say that because there's the possibility for abuse in order maintenance, we shouldn't do order maintenance, is to take away one of the most powerful crime prevention measures that's available to police, probably in terms of crime control, even more important than criminal investigation. And finally, understand the police can't do it alone. They need a whole set of partnerships. What I saw on the streets with those officers, I saw citizens endorsing what the officers were doing. I saw citizens, African-American citizens, properly supporting white officers as they dealt with unruly, drunken behavior that terrorized civil African-American citizens who were on the streets. It wasn't a racial issue. It wasn't a racial issue. They authorized it, and the fact that we believed for a long time that, well, as long as it's against the law, police can enforce it, we've learned a lot that you have to develop community support, and community has to be partners. The second thing is there are all kinds of other partners who have to be involved as well. Business and business improvement districts. Prosecutors got to get out on the street. Probation officers got to get on the street. Judges have to find out what's going on the street and what the consequences of what's going on. Entire neighborhoods living in terror and dread because of a small number of people whom everyone knows. In Boston, everyone knows who the troublemakers are. They're a small number of kids. Probation has authority over them, prosecutors have authority over them, courts have authority over them, the police, there are outstanding warrants. And meantime, these kids are terrorizing the communities while the prosecutors are prosecuting their cases. The police officers are responding to the next call, and neighborhoods live in terror. In 1962, Jane Jacobs wrote the wonderful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She taught us that for commerce to thrive, for neighborhoods to thrive, for strangers to be able to move comfortably through communities, we need minimal levels of security. We figured that out again. We've gotten Jane Jacobs' message. And very, very quickly, we're starting to make a big difference. And the good news is that we haven't seen the best yet. It is yet to come.
George hoped that he would stir you to some questions since he enjoys answering questions better than he does his original lecture. This is being taped for C-SPAN. We're delighted with that. So we're operating under about a 25-minute time restraint. Larry, correct me on that. But George, if you would, I'm sure there are questions, and you can just control the mic.
If any of you decide to give speeches rather than ask questions, keep them to 2 minutes. All right? Yes, ma'am.
No speech. I'm just wondering if you could, with increasing rates of youth violence, if you could talk a little bit about effective strategies for dealing primarily with juveniles. Well,
I think the Boston story right now is just an unusual success story, and it continues to unfold. They're basically prosecutors, federal and state, police, probation officers, got together and understand in Boston there was a real sense of despair. And that is, there was acknowledgement by everyone that things had gotten out of control. They were just out of control. And the prosecutors knew we couldn't continue business as usual anymore. The feds knew it. The police knew it. And so they started to work together, and people from Harvard worked with them. David Kennedy, Ann Peel, and Anthony Braga. And the first thing that they decided to do was to begin to communicate with the youths that violence was over. They knew that there was going to be some drug dealing. They knew there was going to be some other things, but violence would be over. And to make sure that everyone understood that they meant that, their first move was to take out a gang. And through the use of warrants, through the use of probation violations, through the use of arrest for minor offenses, order maintenance problems, they literally took out one of the toughest gangs. And then they continued to meet with gangs. And they said, now look, it's over. There's going to be no more violence. We know who you are. And so a message went out that you even think about violence. And we're coming down on you in every way we can. And the response, again in 1996, no murders. That was a very, very important development. One of the tragedies that they discovered when they began to look at what was going on was that good kids were starting to carry guns and join gangs for self-protection. The streets were so out of control that the good kids who had to use the streets to go to school were beginning to line themselves up in terms of protecting themselves by joining gangs. That ethos has been broken now. Now that approach can work in a whole variety of problems, and it's a very efficient use of the authority that we have. I've been on streets and I've looked around, and you know those kids are on probation. You know that some of them have warrants out. You know that some of them have charges pending. And here they're terrorizing a community. If you change the way of doing business and plan and collaborate, you can take care of that very, very quickly. We've had a very similar response in New York City. What they discovered was fare beaters in some areas, as many as 1 out of 10 fare beaters were carrying guns or had warrants out for violent crime. Well, fine. As soon as they discovered that, they could begin to take them out. And so a very strong message went, you don't carry guns anymore on the streets. Those days are over. We catch you with a gun, and we're going to do everything we can. So I think this is a very promising approach. Now, understand that doesn't deal with the social problems that give rise to gangs. It doesn't solve all kinds of other problems. It doesn't deal with some of the drug dealing, et cetera, but it begins to establish a climate of control. Yes, sir.
Once a police department establishes order maintenance as its principal objective, what are the most effective ways citizens can mobilize to help the police department do its job better?
Well, my own belief is that citizens have to be involved from the very beginning. And that is, good police are going to be working with citizens and are going to be and working with youth and working with the people creating the difficulty. Notice in the example that I gave about youth, they began to talk to the gangs. Look, we know who you are. The probation officers talked to them. They'd meet with the gangs in groups of probation, federal prosecutors, local prosecutors, and say, look, this is what we're going to do. So in that respect, you begin to talk to the troublemakers as well. But ultimately, it has to become self-enforcing. And that is, once the controls get established, that consensus has to persist over time without the presence of officers. And that's what I saw in Newark, New Jersey, that once you develop a consensus, that consensus starts to hold. Because understand, the vast majority of the kids don't want to get shot. They don't want to get killed. They don't want to shoot anyone. They don't want to get in big fights. Remember when you were kids? Remember when you'd square off and you were the toughest, meanest, baddest guy in town? And then finally when the teacher said, knock it off, you'd walk away, no, I can't fight. But how relieved you were? I mean, understand that there are all kinds of kids out there that are out of control and left to their own mercies. And I personally think that when this control comes in and the message gets out, thank goodness. A lot of kids welcome this because they don't have to posture. Yes?
You had commented before about the importance of making sure order maintenance is done right in a democratic society. Could you comment a little bit more on the steps that need to be taken, particularly within police departments, to do that?
Well, that's a very troublesome issue because the guidelines for officers in most departments are non-existent about how to do these kinds of things. In fact, they're very rarely discussed. For a long period of time, order maintenance has been conducted as a form of dirty work in police departments. And that is, well, you do it if you got to do it, or if there's a particular problem, you send a car and shag the kids away. And so there's little understanding of how discretion ought to be used, except intuitive. And let me make a point. I learned about this from police officers. I didn't invent these ideas. I discovered these ideas out in the field. And in a happy little story, I was picked up the other day in Newark by a detective to go meet with administrators, and it turned out that the detective was Smitty, who I walked around with on foot patrol in Newark, New Jersey, and who taught me almost all of these things. And the reason why I discovered it, as I was riding in the car, some kids yelled at him, "Hey, Smitty, Smitty," and all of a sudden, boom, This was the officer I spent more time than with anyone else. But understand that that was done intuitively. There was no guidance for the officer. I think we have to spend a lot of time training officers about how to use their discretion. The courts are very, very nervous and properly nervous. Why do we make an arrest when one person is publicly urinating and we don't make an arrest when somebody else is? Now, I think one can answer that. It's a complex answer, and I think you can teach officers how to do that properly and right, but that needs a whole lot of work inside of police departments. That's why I say you don't go from, today we're going to start order maintenance. We spent a year training officers, taking pictures, taking videos in subways. Does this constitute illegal behavior? What ought you to do in this circumstance? Why ought you to do this? What are the values driving this? All of these issues become very, very important that officers understand them, because they've got to be able to articulate that to the court. Because discretion to many courts sounds like personal inclination. And we're not talking about personal inclination in this. We're talking about establishing policies that the values of the department, the values of the community, and the skills of policing can be brought to bear on these problems. Yes, sir.
What about the Coalition for the Homeless and the array of other nonprofit groups that often seem to be at odds with order maintenance, either filing lawsuits or organizing protests and that type of thing?
Yes.
How can they be dealt with?
Well, ultimately they have to be dealt with politically, they have to be dealt with morally, they have to be dealt with legally, and I think we simply have to put out the arguments that we have put out. I mean, the first thing when I was asked to come into the subway, everyone in the subway knew that the problem was homelessness. The police knew it, the New York Times knew it, all the journals knew it, the administration knew it was homeless. And the first thing I did was to say, the problem isn't homelessness. The homeless have every right to use the subway. In fact, the police responsibility to the homeless is to get them help and to protect their constitutional rights to use the subway. But they can't break rules. They, too, have to abide by the rules of the subway, and as a matter of fact, from now on, and we're going to talk to them, and we spent, like with the gang, we spent 2 weeks handing out information to people who were violating rules and saying, you know, on October 24th, we're going to start to enforce this. But also, I didn't see homeless benefiting by going back into the tunnels to die. What I discovered, 10 to 12 people a month were without addresses were getting killed in the subway. Going back in the tunnels. I mean, as a matter of fact, from my point of view, this was a political move to keep the quote-quote homeless under the nose of the general public, and as far as I was concerned, was really manipulating very, very tragic people. Because you know that the vast majority of the people that are on the streets, and they are terribly tragic, and we don't have a lot of technology to deal with them, but they're serious drug abusers, they're serious alcoholics, attempts to help them are very limited, and you can try, and I think we should keep trying, but at the same time, if you allow these people to aggregate in a particular area, I mean, they'll wipe out parks, they'll wipe out shopping neighborhoods, and they don't benefit from that because it isn't very long until the predators who look like homeless and behave like homeless move in and begin to prey on them and begin to prey on the community as well. So you just can't allow these large congregations of people in public spaces that ultimately are going to destroy the public space. But you can manage them, and they wind up being better off. Yes?
Given our societal penchant for the deep pocket and constitutional rights litigation under the Civil Rights Act, don't communities that undertake this sort of a thing run a terrible risk of judgments, money judgments being entered against them that can almost break a municipality's budget under the civil rights laws, Section 1983 and so forth?
Well, I wish my co-author Catherine Coles was here, and we have at least one example in Baltimore where that was the outcome. But it was the outcome because the police there, and this was prior to the current chief's administration, the police were deliberately not applying the law as it was handed down by the court. And we, in everything we do, our focus is to operate inside the law, and then the law is contested. And so when police departments operate outside the law, which I've never recommended, then they run that risk. But if they stay inside the law, I don't see that as a major risk. And I don't know of many cases that's happened outside of Baltimore. But that was very clear. There was an ordinance that the federal court rejected, said they could not enforce it, and they kept enforcing it for years. The gentleman there, and then, yes.
Is there any solution for a jurisdiction where the public prosecutors refuse to participate in any misdemeanor crime?
A vote. As far as I know, most prosecutors are elected. There's a movement now, and Barbara Boland has been leading in the study of this, of community prosecution. I think community prosecution is going to move very, very quickly, because prosecutors are starting to discover that once they get prosecutors out into the community and prosecutors start meeting with community representatives, that's enormous political capital. And when they start recognizing that, smart district attorneys are going to say, I'm going to get involved in that too. My own prediction is 5 years from now, community prosecution will catch up with community policing. Yes.
You alluded to some of your earlier critics. I'd like to ask you about what some of your current critics are saying. And as I summarize it, it is sort of that the claimed effects of order maintenance are much exaggerated, that there are a whole lot of things going on out there at once, and no particular order. Demographics, longer prison terms for career criminals, stabilization of drug markets, and that you can list the whole long thing, and that the criticism is your thing, while it may have some merit, is not as important as you make it out to be.
Well, I understand that, and it seems to me that it's interesting to read some of these critiques, although I'm pleased to say that, for the most part, those kinds of reviews haven't come out yet. There have been some op-ed pieces that have said that, but most of the reviews have from both liberal and conservative columnists have been very, very supportive. But they're talking about, the confounding effects of the number of people that we have in prison, the changing demographics and things like that. None of that will explain away the subway situation. None of that will. And I think Bill Bratton, more than anyone else, has tried to address those issues. I just saw the other day one commenter saying that, it's because of that the decline was certainly due partially to the police strategy, but it included the changing economic conditions in New York City. Unemployment just went up to 9.25 in New York City. Unemployment is going up and crime is dropping. So I think I think this is an example of holding crime control hostage to the idea, unless you're committed to social change, and I may or may not be, but I think that's irrelevant, then you shouldn't be doing these things, because if we solve the crime problem, that'll take away one of the impetuses, if that's a word, to social change. And so crime control has been held hostage to broad social change. Yes?
Do order maintenance issues play out differently in communities experiencing large numbers of new immigrants?
Large numbers
of new immigrants. Is that liable to create different dynamics from some of the communities you've looked at?
The only research about that has been Wes Scogan's research in Disorder and Decline. And what Wes found, regardless of where you check, the ethnic background, it turns out that there was a broad consensus about what constituted disorderly behavior. And I think the things that I'm talking about, I'm not talking just about being a little loud during festivals. I'm talking about illegal behavior, boom boxes that bother the entire neighborhood, regardless of ethnic backgrounds. But so far, there's been nothing that has suggested that Wes's analysis has somehow changed since he published it in 1990. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the relationship, if any, between truancy at school and order of maintenance? That is, an apparent large percentage of high school students not going to school and wandering?
Well, we've known for a long period of time that truancy and burglary are very highly correlated. you have kids out of school and you get an increase in burglary. I think truancy is an example of low-level disorderly behavior in which people are not meeting their responsibility, and they ought to be dealt with. And whether that's by police department or by truant officers, et cetera, I think they ought to be dealt with. Now, if there are reasons why they're not attending school, those should be dealt with. We should improve our schools. I'm not saying that truancy enforcement is the answer, but we shouldn't be holding again the disorder and crime of youths. We shouldn't be dealing with those problems hostage to dealing with the major problems of schools in our society. Youths should be in school. That's simply the way it is. Yes, sir.
Were there any changes made in the way the courts carry on their business in this city so you had that order maintenance?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, understand that what my goal is in this. You need, when you are saying to groups, look, you are going to have to square away. You need to have the or else. And that is, either you square away or else something is going to happen to you. At that point, you better have the judge informed, you better have the prosecutor informed and involved, and probation involved, etc. But I view this as high activity, low arrest. And that is, and think now what the implications of this in Boston are. As a result of some upfront investments of control, 17 youths are alive, but 17 other youths haven't been killed. Other youths haven't been injured. I mean, in the long haul, I'm talking high activity, low arrest. You might have to start out with more arrest and get the support of the courts, but ultimately low arrest. Once the squeegee people learned that they'd spend a night in jail for not paying the fine, the need to jail them went away because they stopped squeegeeing. But you had to have the initial or else. But I don't know specifically what the changes in court policy was. I do know, and the details of it are in the book, it was just at that time that representatives of the court put through a law in a budget bill that essentially decriminalized all low-level offenses. And that was a disaster. I don't know how that's come up, how that's worked out, but potentially that was a very, very serious problem. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you about tactics for just a second?
About?
Tactics for just
Yes.
a second. How did you know the squeegee men were going to go away after a night in jail? How was that tactic developed? What would you have done if it hadn't worked? Was there a fallback? And do you have an idea how much an operation like that costs or adds to ordinarily budgeted costs?
Well, again, I proceeded as I always do, and that was I was asked by Commissioner Kelly to come in. I asked to work with a group of officers. I was working with a chief and a lieutenant and some officers in neighborhoods. We went out and we talked to the squeegee men. We photographed their activities. We sent unmarked police cars through the squeegee men to see how they responded to different kinds of groups. We talked to people, and after 3 months, I didn't have the slightest idea where I was going with it. And this has happened to me time and time again. And all of a sudden, a lieutenant and a patrol officer were there, and the lieutenant said, "If only we could get the warrants. If only we could get the warrants for their arrest." And I said, "Tell me about that." He said, "Well, we give a DAT, a desk appearance ticket, which both the cops and the squeegee men referred to as disappearance tickets, because basically the attitude is, keep it, I got plenty of them. And of course, if they don't appear, that of course is a jailable offense, but the warrants go into the warrant room of the New York City Police Department. Now, as most police executives will tell you, warrant rooms are black holes. Everything goes in and basically very, very little comes out, and especially with those kind of minor offenses. So I called Paul Scheckman in Morgenthau's office and said, "Paul, for a limited period of time, can we get the warrants that were for squeegeeing back to the foot patrol officers who made the original arrest. And he said, oh, that's tough. How long do you need? And I said, well, how about 6 weeks? He said, well, okay, 6 weeks. And now understand the psychology of a foot patrol officer. First of all, the foot officers are out there, community officer, and he or she is under orders to deal with this problem, and here are these super anti-crime units, and they refer to the, I won't use the actual word, the S work of dealing with squeegee men. So they're scorned by their colleagues for doing that unimportant stuff. And the youths themselves ridicule them. Then all of a sudden, along comes this warrant. Can you imagine how that makes the officer feel? I understand. Now you're going to jail. And so they go to jail, spend a night in jail. And that was all that was it. And it stopped. Now, had it not worked, I would have done more of what I just call mucking around. Talking to the officers, talking to the squeegee men. But one of the things we found out, I mean, immediately the civil libertarians' position was, what you ought to be concerned is apartment and jobs, not these poor homeless kids. 75% of them had legitimate addresses, 50% of them had arrests for violent felonies. I mean, those were tough kids. And at least at one time, I had in a video, got into some kind of a dispute, and very quickly, alongside of one of these cement pilings, quickly grabbed down and had a pipe in his hand, along the side of the car. I mean, these weren't poor people just saying, you know, I need a quarter. This was intimidation as they draped over cars. I have time for one last question. I have answered all your, yes, sir.
Do you see any resistance in this concept in any of the major cities around the country?
I think it is going very, very quickly. I think it is moving and being adopted very, very quickly. Almost every place I go, departments are talking about doing order maintenance, and it is becoming part of the basic strategy of policing. At the same time, I find that worrisome because I'm very worried that we're not going to do it right. I'm afraid that we're going to jump into it without establishing the kind of guidelines that we need to do, without doing the necessary training, and then when they get us to court, then the dangers that were suggested here of it being not understood, done poorly. I think we have to counsel cities. This is a powerful, powerful tool, but it's only powerful if you do it right, if you do it legally, and we want to maintain civility in civil ways. That's the key. Thank you very much for your time and attention.